from the government. In fact, one could contrast, I think, rather vividly what the Canadian government did in the case of Maher Arar, who was rendered, this wasn't torture by the United States, but it involved extraordinary rendition by the US. He was a Syrian-born Canadian who was seized at Kennedy Airport, shipped to Syria, tortured in very horrible ways. And essentially it was a case of mistaken identity. The Canadians investigated this, appointed a high-level commission to do so, issued a national apology, paid him about $10 million in damages, and cleared the decks, as it were. In the United States, he cannot get into court. His case has been thrown out repeatedly, even though it is generally agreed by everyone that this was a terrible mistake. So we stand here with before the problem of accountability and the problem, it seems to me, of what to do next. That is how to back up. I'd like to, there isn't much time, but I think it's important to talk a little bit about these techniques themselves. There is, as I said, a voluminous record here of what they were, what was done. We know it in great detail. I would encourage you to have a look at that record. The protocol, this is a document from the CIA to the Department of Justice, by the way, setting out the individual techniques, dividing them into conditioning techniques, corrective techniques, coercive techniques. It's quite detailed, it's very interesting. Let me, since the case, it seems to me the most difficult case, as John Yoo admitted himself, had to do with waterboarding, I'd like to read a little bit about what that was and talk about how it was legally construed, perhaps as a test case, as it were. This memo, the memos that Bill Roller referred to specifically, were written under great pressure in the spring of 2002. There were two of them. They are dated August 1st, 2002, signed by Jay Bybee, who was the head, at the time, the director of the Office of Legal Counsel, which is the kind of think tank within the Justice Department, sometimes referred to as the conscience of the Justice Department. The story of what happened in there is told in great detail in the Office of Professional Responsibility report. But we should say that this began essentially with a phone call from the CIA that said, we want to, Abu Zubaydah, who was a high-level al-Qaeda suspect, had been captured in Pakistan. In March 2002, he'd been shot, went into a coma. A trauma surgeon was rushed from Baltimore by CIA private jet to try to save his life. Indeed, his life was saved. Interrogation began. The CIA wanted to go forward with various enhanced interrogation techniques, but they were not sure, particularly the leadership of the agency was not sure that these were legal. They called up the Department of Justice. They asked first for a criminal declination, that is advanced immunity. And the OPR describes a lot of negotiations back and forth, after which the Department of Justice declined to give advanced immunity. And then the efforts began on this document that John Yoo first wrote. As I say, it's described in great detail. But the key things to point to, I think, is that it was composed during a time of great controversy within the government. The FBI at a certain point declined to take part in anything and withdrew its expertise completely from this interrogation. The declination was declined. The CIA continued to pressure. You had this guy under lock and key. They wanted to go forward. And finally, we have the detail of John Yoo basically wrestling with each of these techniques, trying to say they're illegal, and eventually confronting waterboarding. He basically says that most of these techniques, nudity, hooding, walling, facial hold, slapping, abdominal slaps, there's a long list of them, that most of these techniques did not even come close to the legal standard torture, but that waterboarding did. It's interesting that when he was interviewed for this report, he told the official interviewing him, I had actually thought that we prohibited waterboarding. I didn't recollect that we had actually said you could do it. He also said, and I think this is worth quoting, that the waterboarding as it's described in the memo is very different from the waterboarding that was described in the press. And so when I read the description in the press of what waterboarding is, I was like, oh, well, obviously that would be prohibited by statute. So we have this very strange world where what the CIA is doing is translated into their bureaucratic language. It's given to the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice gives its opinion, and then you have what actually happens in these black sites on the other side of the world, in which things are very grim and very difficult. Let me read a little bit. This is from the testimony of Abu Zubaydah. My cell was very cold. Loud music was playing. There was a constant loud hissing or crackling noise, which played 24 hours a day. I tried to block out the noise by putting tissue in my ears. The first 3 weeks of this, he was strapped to a chair, naked, very cold, room very bright, light on all the time, music playing 24 hours a day without stop. This is the first conditioning phase in which essentially you're trying to keep the person awake. He's kept awake, he believes, for 3 weeks. It turns out it's 11 days, according to the CIA. About 2.5 months after I arrived in this place, the interrogation began again with more intensity than before. 2 black wooden boxes were brought into the room outside my cell. One of these was tall, about the shape of a coffin. The other was very small, 3.5 feet small. These were the confinement boxes. I was taken out of my cell, and one of the interrogators wrapped a towel around my neck. They used it to swing me around and smash me repeatedly against the hard walls of the room. I was repeatedly slapped in the face. I was put into the tall box for what I think was about 1.5 to 2 hours. The box was totally black on the inside as well as the outside. They put a cloth or cover over the outside to cut off the light and to restrict my air supply. It was difficult to breathe. When I was let out of the box, I saw that one of the walls of the room had been covered with plywood sheeting. From now on, it was against this wall that I was smashed with the towel around my neck. I think that the plywood was there to provide some absorption of the impact of my body, which indeed is true. They didn't want to break his bones, which would have made him difficult to interrogate. After the beating, I was then placed in the small box. They placed a cloth or cover over the box to cut out light. It was not high enough to sit upright. I had to crouch down. It was difficult because of my wounds. The stress on my legs, remember he had been shot 3 times. Stress on my legs meant both the wounds in my leg and stomach became very painful. It was always cold in the room, but when the cover was placed over the box, it made it hot and sweaty inside. The wound in my leg began to open and started to bleed. I don't know how long I remained in the small box. I think I may have slept or fainted. I was then dragged from the small box, unable to walk properly, and put on what looked like a hospital bed. It's a kind of gurney, and strapped down very tightly with belts. A black cloth was placed over my face. The interrogators used a mineral water bottle to pour water on the cloth so that I could not breathe. After a few minutes, the cloth was removed, and the bed was rotated into an upright position. The pressure of the straps on my wounds was very painful. I vomited. The bed was then again lowered to a horizontal position, and the same torture carried out again with the black cloth over my face and water poured on from a bottle. On this occasion, my head was in a more backward, downwards position, and the water was poured on for a longer time. I struggled against the straps trying to breathe, but it was hopeless. I thought I was going to die. I lost control of my urine. Since then, I still lose control of my urine when under stress. I was then placed again in the tall box. While I was inside the box, loud music was played, and somebody kept banging repeatedly on the box from the outside. I was squatted down because of the small space, the bucket with the urine tipped over. I remained in the box several hours, maybe overnight. I was then taken out, and again a towel was wrapped around my neck. I was smashed into the wall with a plywood sheeting and repeatedly slapped in the face. This is a small excerpt from a very long document which describes the individual interrogations of 12 to 14 detainees. It's clear that these techniques are used in combination. It's clear that waterboarding often results in unconsciousness and almost always in vomiting. The descriptions are fairly hair-raising. But what is interesting about them is, or among the things it seems to me that is interesting about them, is the transformation of these events through bureaucratic language into something else.